Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. The cultural impact of the Bible is hard to overstate. Even if you wouldn't call yourself Christian or Jewish, you probably use phrases and idioms that are biblical in origin. Any underdog story or sports matchup is a battle of David versus Goliath. A shibboleth, a word that comes from Judges 12, is still used today to refer to a kind of in-group password. Another biblical reference turned commonplace phrase is the subject of our video today. We're talking about a golden calf, some kind of idol or object of worship, especially something monetary, that is held in perversely high regard. This is another one of those idioms that people use and are familiar with, but might not necessarily know its ins and outs from the biblical story. Today we're going to dive into the context and background of the golden calf, and we'll explore how these images were understood. Were they heresy, orthodoxy, or a mix of both? The imagery of the golden calf appears primarily in two biblical texts, Exodus 32 and 1 Kings 12. The Exodus 32 story is the one more people are probably familiar with. In this story, Moses is up on Mount Sinai getting the law from God written on 2 tablets. Meanwhile, the people of Israel see that Moses is not coming down, and they ask his brother Aaron, their head priest, to come make us gods who will go before us. Since they don't know what's happened to Moses, the man who brought them out of Egypt, they aren't sure how to proceed on their journey. So, Aaron collects all of their gold jewelry, he melts it down, and he makes it into a statue of a calf, saying, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." Now, 2 things are noteworthy in this episode. This phrase about being brought out of Egypt is important, and we'll get into that in a moment. What's also interesting here is that it seems as though there is more than one statue, but later it's treated as just one object. Now, anyway, this episode is followed by a festival at the foot of Mount Sinai where the Israelites sacrifice to the golden calf and they feast and dance. In the middle of all that, God speaks to Moses, who's still up on the mountain, and tells him what's going on. God says that the people you brought out of Egypt have made an idol in the shape of a calf and are saying, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." So Moses goes down the mountain and makes his entrance by throwing down the tablets of the law. Then he takes the calf, burns it in the fire, grinds it up into a powder, puts it in water, and makes the people drink it. And then Moses confronts Aaron, who deflects blame onto the people. He basically says he just collected the gold and tossed it into the fire, and lo and behold, this calf idol just jumped out. Now, this is obviously treated as a grave sin. It's either a violation of the first or second commandment, and the people certainly pay a heavy toll for it. If you're familiar with the golden calf from the Bible, that's probably the story you've heard before. Now, what you might not realize is that this golden calf appears in another place in the Bible, and there are lots of parallels between this second appearance and the one in Exodus 32. To get to that second appearance, we'll fast forward to 1 Kings chapter 12. Now, the Israelites aren't being led by a great prophet at this point, but by a king. And not by one king, but by 2 kings. The united kingdom of David and Solomon has split in 2, with Rehoboam ruling the southern kingdom, and an interesting character named Jeroboam ruling the 10 northern tribes. After the 2 kingdoms avoid a civil war, Jeroboam is cited as building up Shechem, an early Israelite political center, as his capital. He then goes and builds up Peniel, or Penuel, as his capital. This is the location where Jacob wrestled the angel and was given the name Israel. According to Genesis, Jacob named the face Peniel because there he had seen the face of God. It was also a very important Yahwistic worship center. Despite this building campaign, Jeroboam is concerned that his breakaway kingdom won't last. He's afraid the people will worship Yahweh in Jerusalem and be drawn to the king of Judah, leaving him behind. So, what does he do? Well, he manufactures 2 golden calves. And he tells his people, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Sound familiar? He places 1 calf each in Dan and Bethel. He essentially places one at the northern end of his kingdom and one at the southern end. He even tells them, look, it's just too far for you to go worship in Jerusalem, so I've made these awesome places of worship close to home. Now again, it's notable that Bethel, meaning house of El, is the location where Jacob saw a ladder up to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. It was another important pre-existing cultic site, like Peniel. Now these golden calves are said to become a sin. The people went and worshipped them. Jeroboam made new festivals linked with these idols and appointed priests from outside the traditional priestly lineages to oversee the sites. He was breaking taboos all over the place. These are the sins of Jeroboam that are so frequently cited in the book of Kings, the standard against which all northern kings are judged. Jehu, for example, kills the last of the Omrides and rules over Israel. He sets a trap for the priests of Baal and has them all killed at a festival he held as a ruse to get them all in one spot. But the texts say that despite him eliminating Baal worship, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. Jeroboam's legacy is the establishment of these idolatrous images and sites that continued in the northern kingdom for generations. Now, the many similarities between these two texts probably leaves you with some questions. How, if at all, are they related? The parallels seem too close for there to be no connection, but how should we understand the relationship of these two stories? Let's start by looking at the history surrounding these texts.
We're going to start by talking a bit about these two texts together. There are questions about their historicity, or at least that of the Exodus account. The question is, to what extent do these texts describe actual events in a way that we today would understand as historical, versus to what extent are these more ancient Near Eastern texts where historicity is only one of many concerns, like making a very particular theological point. Many scholars cast some doubt on the Exodus account for a number of reasons that we can't really get into right now. The first Kings account is often taken to be much more historical in the modern sense of the word, with the Exodus account crafted to match its features and make a theological point about Jeroboam's actions. Though we should note some prominent scholars disagree with the priority of the first King text, we're going to take a different approach now. So we'll deal with the possible implications of this conclusion later, but for now we'll stick to the historicity question. So whatever the historicity of the text, it's clear that these two texts are meant to be linked as pieces of literature. We can see this with the repeated use of the phrase, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This phrase is meant to link these two stories. As these stories took their final form, common words and phrases like this one were used to link the texts together, so you, the reader, make connections in the themes and theology developed in both stories. Most scholars suggest that this phrase was first used by Jeroboam, then read back into the story of Moses and Aaron at Sinai, and its original use was as Jeroboam set up the cult sites in Dan and Bethel. Now, there's actually a fair amount of archaeological corroboration with the story in Kings. While Bethel, identified with the modern village of Beitin, was excavated in the early 20th century, it doesn't have much to contribute. Tel Dan, on the other hand, has an impressive sequence of bamot at this site which date to the Iron II. At this site, we see these multiple cult shrines built one on top of the other. In fact, in Stratum 4, Bama A is dated by the excavators to the 10th century, and this would be almost certainly be the high place built by Jeroboam. It has large cut blocks which were later incorporated into Bama B, but also an ashlar block or a cut stone altar platform, a libation installation, and several auxiliary rooms. If you visit the site today, you'll see this structure, which is Bama B, the 9th century Amrite rework of the structure. There was some 8th century rework to the structure as well, but what you see is a 9th century cult site, which is built on top of the 10th century one built by Jeroboam. This is certainly where his golden calves would have been installed and where the Israelites would have worshipped it. As for the golden calves which we see in both accounts, we do have several examples of calf or bull statuary from cultic contexts. The most obvious is from the so-called bull site. The single period site in what is now the northern West Bank was an early Iron Age bama or high place. There's a circular enclosure made by a wall consisting of large boulders brought from off-site. Inside there's a small paved area in front of an upright stone. This may be either an altar or a matzebah or a standing stone. At the site, this bronze bull was also found. It measures 17.5 centimeters long and 12.5 centimeters high, so it's really not big. It's the largest bull statue currently known from Iron Age Canaan. The site is a single-phase high place, and there are no other material culture signatures to indicate who may have worshipped there, nor is there any indication of what or who the bull is meant to represent specifically. Now, going further back in time, there's a small bronze bull found at Hathor, dated to the Late Bronze Age. Even further back in time, from the Middle Bronze Age, is a silver-plated bronze alloy calf, which was associated with this small shrine. It was found in a cultic context near the Middle Bronze Age gate at the site of Ashkelon and dates to the 16th century, so not close to either the Exodus or 1 Kings stories chronologically. This calf is small, only 10 centimeters long, and was made of a tin arsenic alloy, or bronze, and had a thin silver overlay, like 1.5 millimeters thin, very thin. This is clearly a calf and not a bull like the other examples. It's generally thought to represent the storm god, as the storm god in Canaanite myth is typically youthful and energetic like a calf, whereas El, the old father of the gods, is associated with the bull. That brings us to the question of who or what were the golden calves in the Bible meant to represent. Scholars are divided on who or what the calves represent, but we'll share what we think is most likely. First off, there's the question of whether this is meant to be a depiction of a deity in animal form, or if this is meant to be a platform for an invisible deity. Attribute animals are common in ancient Near Eastern iconography, and we often see deities standing on top of them. Either possibility could be true, or both could be true. It could have been thought of one way originally, and then another way over time. Whichever way it was understood, as a depiction or a platform, there are a lot of suggestions for which deity these golden calves should be linked with. For Exodus 32, it's been suggested this was an Apis bull, but this is very unlikely because the Apis bull was a live bull in Egypt. It's been suggested it was Hathor, but for a number of reasons this is also unlikely. Why would the Israelites worship an Egyptian god for delivering them from Egypt? Also, given the link between the Exodus account and the 1 Kings account, it's hard to imagine Jeroboam installing Egyptian gods at cult sites, particularly when he seems to be intentionally trying to link himself with Yahwistic centers. Other suggestions are that this is the Syro-Mesopotamian moon god Sin. The moon god was popular in Aramean polities and in Mesopotamia, and in those places he was often associated with a bull. But we don't see moon worship being particularly prevalent in the Old Testament. It shows up here and there, but it doesn't seem to be a common feature of Israelite practice, even non-sanctioned practice. More commonly, the bulls are linked with Baal. Baal is occasionally linked with the bull in Ugaritic sources, but it's not the attribute animal primarily associated with Baal. The Old Testament often links Israelite idolatry, as with the calf, with Baal worship. But that's not a super strong link, and most scholars don't really see the calves as Baal. And going back to the Jehu story, we see Jehu removes Baal worship, but not the calves. Jehu did not understand the calves to be associated with Baal worship at all. In fact, he seems to leave them as an acceptable part of Israelite religious practice. What a lot of scholars now are coming around to is to see the calves in Exodus and Kings as either linked with the Canaanite god El or with Yahweh. To muddy the waters a bit further, a lot of scholars think that the Israelites conflated El and Yahweh, and that only over time was Yahweh differentiated from El. Exodus 6 seems to hint at this when it says, "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself fully known to them." This seems to be biblical evidence that the Israelites didn't always distinguish between Yahweh and the old Canaanite creator god El. In Ugaritic literature, El is clearly associated with the bull. He's even called Bull El. The patriarch Jacob, who, as we mentioned, is linked with the site of Bethel, worships the mighty one of Jacob, which is linguistically very similar to the phrase the bull of Jacob. This may be a play on words linking the god of Jacob with the bull, and again, Bethel means house of God or house of El. I mean, I could keep going, but there are lots of reasons why some scholars link the golden calves with the deity El. These were straight-up depictions of El, the Canaanite god, but I tend to disagree. Well, I think the bull and calf imagery likely goes back to El. I think the golden calves were meant to be associated with Yahweh from the outset. These calves are always linked with the God of the Exodus, which everywhere in the Bible is linked with Yahweh. Jeroboam puts these calves up to keep his people from going to Jerusalem. He wants them to be the national God of Israel. He's clearly trying to establish his connection with Yahweh in his early days as king, not impose some foreign deity. We see in Exodus the Israelites celebrate a feast saying, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh." And given the connection with the 1 Kings story, it's not unreasonable to assume that the new festivals Jeroboam instituted were likewise Yahwistic. Jeroboam even gives his son Abijah a Yahwistic name. It seems most likely then that the calves were meant to be associated with Yahweh. The real questions, I think, are, were these meant to be pedestals on which an invisible Yahweh stood, the way that the Ark of the Covenant was the footstool of an invisible God enthroned above the cherubim? Or were they meant to be visual depictions, just plain idols of Yahweh? And to what extent were the calf images heretical? Or better, when did these become heretical?
Now, thankfully, there are a lot of scholars who have looked into these questions, and these questions are interrelated. What were the calves understood to be, and how did that understanding change over time? And how did this fit with the larger evolution toward an iconism in Israelite religion? Now, it's clear enough that in the Old Testament we have today, the calves were condemned as idols. Exodus and Kings both indicate the calves were presented as your gods. So the biblical text presents the calves as idols of Yahweh, clear violations of the second commandment. Biblical scholars and archaeologists recognize indications of aniconism in Israelite religion since the Iron One, which is in line with wider religious trends in the region. But harsh iconoclastic condemnations don't really start until the 8th century. It's then that the classical prophets condemn this kind of idolatry, starting chronologically with Hosea, but continuing with multiple others. And this really kicks off the iconoclastic reforms under Hezekiah and Josiah. There are clear enough indications that certain Israelite religious practices were accepted before the reforms, but condemned after them. Centralization of worship at Jerusalem is a very good example. The reformer kings centralized worship at the temple in Jerusalem. That is the only legitimate place to worship Yahweh. But we see, for example, the judge and prophet Samuel participating in a Yahwistic feast at a shrine or high place. Solomon seeks out God at a high place in Gibeon, and God responds to him. So there are clearly evolutions in what was accepted Yahwistic practice. One scholar, Chung, argues that these calves are best understood in that category as well. They were not meant to be idolatrous originally. Instead, he thinks of Jeroboam as a bit of a conservative, and that his calves were meant to be understood as platforms for Yahweh. The Ark of the Covenant, where the invisible Yahweh sat enthroned over the cherubs, was in Jerusalem. His calves have a similar function to the Ark, meant to be representations of sacred emptiness, the invisible Yahweh standing over this attribute animal. Over time, the pedestal came to be worshipped as an image of Yahweh himself. And not only were they worshipped as idols of Yahweh, but they were put up with the intention of making sure people didn't go to worship in Jerusalem. Acceptable Israelite cultic practice shifted over time, and the orthodoxy of Jerusalem-only worship became dominant within Judahite elite and prophetic circles. With this shift, the calves at Bethel and Dan became increasingly heretical as violations of the Deuteronomistic law, both as symbols of idolatry and violations of the Deuteronomistic law of Jerusalem-only worship. Okay, so that's all great for the historicity of Jeroboam's golden calf and the interpretation of this symbol. But the more well-known appearance of the golden calf is in Exodus at Mount Sinai, and we already said that the historicity of this event is much more up in the air than the account in 1 Kings. What do we make of this famous episode if it may not be historically part of the Exodus story that millions of people know and love? Now, I'll start by saying that the whole historicity of the Exodus event has been inconclusive since scholars first started asking those questions. We have a whole series on some other questions around the Exodus event, and where we come down is that it's historically plausible or even probable, but on a smaller scale and at a later date than is given by traditional interpretation. The Sinai event is similarly inscrutable, historically speaking. We don't have a golden calf artifact or evidence of a mass assemblage of people around Mount Sinai in the right time frame. We don't have any written records from the event. So, what can we say about it? Well, it's noteworthy to us that when we look at traditions around the Exodus in later texts, we see several familiar elements, but they aren't connected in the way that we see them in the Sinai event. The Psalms and the prophets both repeatedly mention Israel coming out of Egypt. Now, this represents a very old tradition within Israel. Hosea and Micah speak about the golden calves in Samaria and at Bethel, but they never connect them with the Exodus event. Now, this doesn't mean that there was definitively no such event as part of the Exodus, only that it isn't mentioned in later texts where we might expect to see it. So, while the Sinai event itself isn't something we can evaluate historically, what we can say is that the way this account is crafted in the text that we have is clearly meant to connect it to Jeroboam's idolatry. It's the same type of event with the same language surrounding it, and in both cases the idolatry is roundly condemned. Now, this is one of many ways we see that the Torah, the first books in the Hebrew Bible, were in fact shaped by later reformist and post-exilic concerns. The way the account of the idolatry at Sinai is told in the text represents Israel's later aniconic reforms being written back into its foundational narratives to bolster the theology of reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah. Now, that's not to say the reformers were wrong in their theology. In fact, we would agree with it today. But it is to say that the shape of Israel's foundational stories reflect theological concerns much later than the setting of events in these texts. Now, again, that's not to say these texts are wrong or that they lack authority if they can't be definitively tied to historical events. The historicity of these events may be an unsolvable question, but the way they communicate God's eternal truth is not called into question by issues of historicity. To me, this development of the text is an example of God progressively working to more fully reveal God's truth through the people of Israel over the course of their history. If you want to learn more about how the telling of Israel's early history was shaped by its later history, check out our video on the 6th century collapse, a series of events, including the Babylonian exile, that fundamentally shaped the Bible we have today. First of all, shout out to Zach Miller over at What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You here on YouTube for suggesting this topic. Zach is a friend of the channel and has been kind enough to have both of us on for interviews, so after this video, you should go check him out. He's been publishing a lot of great stuff. But for now, we'll say thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. Be sure to check out our references and resources in the description below if you're interested in this topic and you want to learn more. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to take a minute to subscribe, and you can check out our series on the Exodus or our video on the 6th century collapse. You can also check out our website, beneaththebible.com, and follow us on social media at Beneath the Bible. Finally, we have opened up channel membership here on YouTube, so if you want to help support the work that we're doing, you can check out the join button down below. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. Until next time, keep digging.